The room was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that clings to the air when history is about to be written. Eyes darted toward the woman at the center of it, all Representative Jasmine Crockett, her shoulders squared, her gaze unflinching. Every opponent, every skeptic, every quiet whisper of doubt had gathered in that courtroom, pressing down like invisible chains. And yet she did not flinch. She leaned into the microphone and delivered a line so sharp, so brilliantly precise that it cut through the air like a blade. Gasps rippled. Some smirked in disbelief, others shifted uncomfortably. But one man, seated just above the fray, did not move immediately. Justice Stephen Breyer, known for measured words, and even more measured silences, stilted his head, his eyes narrowing as though her brilliance had struck a chord deeper than anyone anticipated. His hands folded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, he leaned forward. The weight of that gesture rippled through the chamber. It wasn't just a movement. It was recognition, respect, the kind that cannot be faked, the kind that even the harshest critics cannot dismiss. Suddenly, every voice that had mocked her, every headline that had doubted her, every whisper that had questioned whether she belonged in that room collapsed into silence. Narration wrapped around the moment like a drumbeat. Brilliance against arrogance, dignity against disdain. Crockett's words had not just answered a question, they had shifted the ground beneath the courtroom itself. Camera zoomed in, capturing Breyer's eyes fixed on her, a rare glimmer of something almost reverent in his stare. The energy was no longer hers alone to carry. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they were too small, too inexperienced, too unworthy of standing in such a place. For one suspended heartbeat, it felt as if time itself paused. The audience froze. The gavel rested midair. Even the hum of fluorescent lights seemed to fall silent. The moment had claimed its power, and no one could deny what was unfolding. The narrator's voice lowered, deliberate and charged, the moment Justice Breyer spoke. The courtroom itself seemed to stop breathing. But what came next, what no one, not even Jasmine Crockett herself, could have predicted would leave even the Supreme Court stunned. In Washington, hearings are rarely just about the law. They are theater, battleground, and referendum all at once. This particular session carried a weight far beyond its docket. It wasn't just about policy or precedent. It was about who, truly, had the authority to define the nation's values. The center of the storm stood Jasmine Crockett, a young black congresswoman whose every word was measured not only against the statute but against centuries of expectation. To some, she was a rising star. To others, she was a target. Pundits whispered that she lacked the gravitas, that her youth and directness would betray her. Detractors, many of them seasoned power brokers, scoffed at the idea that she could hold her own under the unforgiving glare of a courtroom where reputations are broken in seconds. Every glance from across the aisle carried the same undertone. She's not ready. She doesn't belong here. And yet the stakes could not have been higher. Her words would not vanish into the ether. They would be transcribed, televised, dissected. A single misstep could brand her forever in headlines, reduce her brilliance to a soundbite twisted against her. Reputation, credibility, legacy, all of it trembled on the knife's edge of this one confrontation. This wasn't just another appearance. It was a test of belonging, a trial by fire in the full view of the American public. Millions tuned in. Some with curiosity, others with sharpened knives of criticism. They didn't know what they were about to see. They couldn't have known that this seemingly ordinary hearing was on the brink of becoming a cultural touchstone for every young immigrant child watching, for every family who had been told to stay in their lane, for every worker who felt unseen. This was about more than legal arguments. It was about identity, visibility, and validation. The energy in the chamber thickened with tension. Cameras captured beads of sweat, folded arms, raised brows. The antagonists grew louder in their disdain, confident that their seniority would crush her resolve. They mistook her silence for weakness, her calm for hesitation. But beneath that, still exterior, something unshakable was building. The narrator's voice sharpened. Millions watching had no idea. They were about to witness one of the most unforgettable exchanges in courtroom history, and yet before the brilliance could shine, before the validation could echo, The villains would have their chance to sneer, but before her brilliance could shine, the villainous chorus of arrogance had its turn. They had been circling her for months, waiting for the moment she would falter. To them, Jasmine Crockett was not a colleague, but a curiosity, young, fiery black congresswoman whose sharp tongue and sharper mind unsettled the established order. Her very presence in those marbled halls was to some an intrusion. And so, they dressed their disdain in sarcasm and condescension. Every smirk a reminder of the gauntlet she was forced to run. The critics lined up long before the hearing began. Political opponents painted her as a headline chaser more interested in sound bites than substance. Whisper campaigns fed the narrative that she lacked discipline, that brilliance in debate could never translate into true leadership. They mocked her sharpness, twisting her intelligence into an accusation. Too combative, too emotional, too inexperienced. These were not critiques of her performance. They were the well-worn weapons of arrogance, designed to box her in and keep her brilliance from being taken seriously. On the Senate floor, in backroom conversations, and on the endless spin cycles of television punditry, the message was clear. She was clever, but not credible. One opponent, with decades in the game, chuckled openly during her speeches, as though her words were nothing more than the rehearsed lines of a school debate. Others spoke over her, cutting her sentences short with dismissive interjections. Their tones dripped with patronizing certainty, their smiles carrying the smugness of men who believed history was already written in their favor. And yet, there was something fragile behind their arrogance. They had spent years mastering the art of control of the narrative, control of the conversation, control of the very definition of legitimacy. Crockett was a disruption they could not predict, a force they could not categorize. She came armed not with rehearsed platitudes, but with unshakable conviction, and that terrified them. Still, fear often masquerades as confidence, and so they laughed louder, scoffed harder, and pushed their dismissiveness further. One antagonist in particular became the face of this arrogance. He smirked as though the outcome was already written, voice dripping with certainty that nothing Crockett could say would matter. To him, she was a prop in a game he had long ago mastered. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a portrait of entitlement. Every word he spoke carried the weight of decades in power, but also the rod of overconfidence. He underestimated her, believing the crowd would side with the familiar rather than the fearless. The history of their attempts to overshadow her was long and deliberate. When she demanded accountability, they drowned her out with procedural noise. When she fought for justice, they buried her arguments under mockery. And when she stood in her truth, they twisted it into caricature. Arrogance was their weapon, but arrogance is a double-edged blade, one that dulls with overuse. One that cuts its wielder when faced with unshakable brilliance. Narration slowed. Voice low and deliberate, he smirked as though the outcome was already written, but arrogance has a way of writing its own downfall. And that's when Jasmine Crockett's story truly began to matter. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in that courtroom by accident. Her story was not the tale of an overnight sensation, but of a fighter who had walked through fire and carried the scars to prove it. Long before the cameras captured her brilliance, she was a lawyer working long hours for clients who could barely afford representation. She chose cases others ignored, the messy, complicated fights that rarely made headlines but often decided whether a family kept its dignity or lost everything. In crowded offices and dimly lit courtrooms, she sharpened her voice against the whetstone of injustice. Those early years were not glamorous. There were nights when the exhaustion weighed heavier than the law books stacked on her desk. She knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be told she was too young, too black, too female, to command authority in a room full of old power. Judges looked past her, opposing counsel underestimated her, and even allies doubted her capacity. But every doubt became fuel. Every condescending glance was another brick laid in the foundation of her resolve. Her fire was not born of rage alone, but of love for community, for fairness, for the stubborn idea that the law should serve the people rather than the powerful. She fought for those without voices, knowing that victories in the shadows often mattered more than applause in the spotlight. It was in those battles, far from national television, that she learned how to stand when the ground shook beneath her. Yet vulnerability was never absent from her journey. There were moments she questioned whether the struggle was worth it, nights when failure seemed to press in from all sides, when insults cut deeper than she wanted to admit. But even in those moments, she refused to surrender. She allowed herself to feel the weight of disappointment, then stood again, taller than before. Persistence became her language, resilience her armor. When she stepped into politics, the challenges only multiplied. She was underestimated once again, painted as a disruptor rather than a leader. But disruption was precisely what was needed. She carried into the political arena the same unshakable conviction she had honed in the courtroom, that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Her words, sharp and unflinching, made allies nervous and opponents furious. Yet beneath that fire was discipline and understanding that courage without strategy is chaos. Each step forward demanded sacrifice. Family moments missed, friendships strained, peace traded for purpose. And still, she pressed on. Because Jasmine Crockett was not chasing titles, she was carrying the weight of every person told they did not belong. Her victories were never solely her own. They were shared with those who saw themselves in her climb. The admiration she earned was not because she was flawless, but because she was unafraid to be human. Her stumbles were lessons, her scars proof of the battles fought, her persistence an anthem for those who had been silenced. Viewers who knew her story saw not just a politician, but a mirror reflection of their own struggles, their own dreams of being more than what the world told them they could be. And so, when she sat in that courtroom facing the sneers of arrogance, she carried more than her own reputation. She carried the countless nights she refused to quit, the weight of voices that had no platform, the fire of every community dismissed by the powerful. Every trial, every insult, every dismissal had shaped her into the woman the nation was about. To witness, the narrator's voice deepened, every syllable ringing with inevitability. Every battle, every late night, every insult she endured, all of it prepared her for the moment the court would freeze. The courtroom was no longer just a chamber of law. It had become an arena. Every glance, every murmur, every pause was charged with the electricity of a duel. The air itself seemed to thicken, as though the walls knew a battle of wills was about to reach its peak. Jasmine Crockett stood at her table, poised yet relentless, her eyes unflinching as she scanned the faces of her opponents. They had tried every trick in the book: procedural distractions, smug interruptions, theatrical posturing meant to draw laughter from their allies in the gallery. But Crockett had not been rattled, not yet. Across from her, the antagonists huddled, their voices dripping with disdain. One leaned back in his chair, arms crossed as though watching a child try to play with the adults. Another whispered to his colleague, followed by the faintest smirk, a smirk that said she doesn't belong here. Then, as though on cue, the attack began. "Counselor Crockett," one of them drawled, his voice slow and mocking. "You've argued with passion, but passion does not make precedent. Surely you must know that." The words landed like a slap. His tone was calculated, designed not just to dismiss her argument, but to reduce her presence, to shrink her stature in the eyes of the court. Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her voice crisp. "Passion doesn't make precedent, but neither does arrogance. The law does. And perhaps if you spent less time mocking and more time listening, you'd realize the law is not on your side." A quiet gasp rippled through the courtroom. For a heartbeat, the mocker faltered. His grin slipped, but the attacks continued. Another antagonist rose, papers in hand, his words sharp as blades. "Your case is built on rhetoric, nothing more. You weave emotion. But where is your substance? Where is your precedent? Surely you must have something more than theatrics to offer this court." The tone was colder, heavier. They were tightening the trap, a chorus of dismissal designed to corner her. Each question came faster than the last, overlapping, pressing. Her into a cage of condescension, Crockett stood her ground. She flipped through her notes, her voice steady, deliberate. For every jab, she had a counter. For every attempt to corner her, she found a path out. The courtroom could feel it. The duel was intensifying, each side raising the stakes. And then came the silence. Justice Breyer, who had sat quietly all this time, leaned forward ever so slightly. He had not spoken. He had not moved. His eyes told a story, weighing Crockett's brilliance against their arrogance, studying whether her sharpness was a spark or a flame. The silence was unbearable. Every heart seemed to beat louder in that chamber. The antagonists smirked again, confident they had her pinned. The gallery leaned forward in anticipation, and Crockett drew a deep breath, gathering the weight of every battle she had fought, every insult she had endured. Every night, she had prepared for moments like this. The next exchange would decide it. Her opponent pounced, his words cutting the silence like a knife. Miss Crockett, you stand here waving principles, but this is the Supreme Court. Principles are not enough. Do you truly believe this court will side with a speech over the weight of tradition? The arrogance was palpable. The question was not just legal, it was personal. It was designed to end her right there, and for a moment, the room held its breath. The narrator's voice cut through the suspense. Tension was unbearable. One misstep could shatter her momentum. Every eye was on Crockett. This was the moment where careers were broken, where reputations crumbled, where even the strongest voices faltered, but not hers. She lifted her head slowly, eyes locked with her accuser. And in a voice that carried both fire and clarity, she struck back, not with rage, not with theatrics, but with something far more devastating: precision. The gallery froze. The antagonist stiffened. Even Breyer's gaze sharpened. And in that instant, then, with one breathtaking move, she seized the room. The air inside the chamber was heavy, not just with tension, but with something deeper, anticipation. The kind of anticipation that makes your heartbeat align with the ticking of the clock, that makes even the faint shuffle of papers sound like thunder. Every eye was on Jasmine Crockett. She had endured every slight, every attempt to dismiss her, every sneer cloaked in legal jargon. They had pushed her into corners, cutting her off mid-sentence, weaponizing procedure like a blade. But now it was her turn. Crockett rose. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice, when it came, was steady measured, but carrying a force that pulled the room taut. "Your Honors," she began, her words cutting cleanly through the stale courtroom air. "We stand here at the intersection of law and humanity, and at that crossroads, the Constitution is not a weapon for the powerful. It is a shield for the people." The first pause fell. The silence was different this time. Not the silence of dismissal, not the silence of waiting for her to falter. It was the silence of recognition, like the collective breath of a jury leaning forward, sensing that something irreversible was about to unfold. Asterisk across the aisle, her antagonists shifted in their seats. They were used to dominance, to dictating, the rhythm of debate. But Crockett had stolen the tempo. She pressed forward. For weeks. My colleagues have attempted to frame this case as a technicality, a procedural mishap. They want you to believe this is nothing more than a matter of formality. But strip away the jargon, and what do we see? We see the rights of everyday Americans placed on the chopping block. Gasps flickered through the gallery. It wasn't showmanship. It was truth delivered with a precision that struck harder than any insult could. One of the opposing attorneys, red-faced, leaped to object. "This is inflammatory." Crockett didn't flinch. She turned, her eyes narrowing with quiet fire. "What's inflammatory?" she shot back, her voice sharpened like steel. "Is the idea that this court should ignore the very principles it was built upon. What's inflammatory is pretending that justice can be decided by those who profit from its absence." A hush fell again. The objection died midair. The antagonist slumped back, his words swallowed by the gravity of her counterattack. Now she had the room. She knew it. Crockett's tone softened, not to weaken her argument, but to drive it deeper. "I have been told my entire career that I am too passionate, that I let fire overtake reason, that I should learn to be quiet, to defer, to smile politely while others rewrite the rules. But passion," she said, Letting the word hang is not weakness. It is what keeps us from surrendering when the odds are stacked against us. Her voice dipped lower, almost intimate, forcing the room to lean in. Every battle, every late night, every insult I endured prepared me for this moment. Because this isn't about me. It never was. It is about the millions who cannot stand here today to speak for themselves. The gallery stirred against soft murmurs, stifled tears. The weight of her words wasn't theatrical. It was lived, carved into her by years of being underestimated, dismissed, and fought down. Justice Breyer, who had been silent all this time, leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled. His face betrayed nothing, yet his eyes followed every syllable, watching, calculating. Crockett knew the moment of truth was here. She tightened her grip on the lectern, steadied her breath, and unleashed the line that would shatter the arrogance. Across the aisle, if the Constitution does not bend to protect the powerless, then it is not justice, it is privilege. And privilege has no place in this courtroom. The words slammed into the chamber like a gavel crack. Silence. Absolute silence. The antagonist's confidence, so smug only moments earlier, crumbled visibly. They avoided her gaze. One reached for a glass of water with trembling hands. Another scribbled furiously as if ink could salvage the unraveling. But there was no salvaging. Crockett had done what they never anticipated. She had transformed defense into offense.
Taking their weapons and turning them into ashes for the first time that day.
Justice Breyer shifted forward. Slowly, deliberately, his eyes softened not into warmth, but into something rarer in a judge of his stature. Respect. He rested his chin lightly on his hand and gave the smallest of nods. A gesture so subtle, yet so powerful, that it sent a ripple through the room. And in that single motion, it was as if he validated everything Jasmine Crockett had fought for. The gallery exhaled collectively. Some gasped. Others simply sat in stunned stillness, as if unwilling to break the sacredness of the moment. Even the walls of the chamber seemed to vibrate with the gravity of it. Crockett did not gloat. She did not smirk. She stood tall, her breathing even, her eyes resolute. Because this wasn't about victory. It was about justice. But the villains weren't finished, not yet. One of them made a desperate attempt, slamming his palm onto the table. This is grandstanding, irrelevant. The law is on our side. Crockett turned slowly. Her voice, calm and razor-sharp, sliced through his bluster. The law, she said, each syllable deliberate, is not your possession. It is the people's promise, when you don't get to twist it into your weapon. Another gasp. This one, louder. The antagonist froze, his fury choking into silence, his arrogance once towering. Collapsed in real time under the sheer inevitability of her words, and then the chamber was still. A stillness that wasn't emptiness, but power. The kind of silence that speaks louder than thunder. That silence belonged to Crockett now. Her counter-argument had landed like a meteor. Leaving the opposition scorched and stunned, Justice Breyer leaned forward again, and for the first time in the entire exchange, his voice broke the air. Proceed. 2 syllables. That was all, but those words and the weight behind them were enough. It wasn't just that she had won that exchange. It was that she had claimed something far greater. Recognition, the kind that cannot be bought, cannot be faked. The kind that comes only from proving, under the most impossible pressure, that you belong. The chamber had witnessed it. And the nation would soon replay it in headlines and clips, in whispered conversations, about the day Jasmine Crockett broke the silence of the court. But the climax wasn't over. Not yet, because it wasn't Breyer's words alone that would reverberate. It was her reaction, the quiet strength in her posture, the calm fire in her eyes that would echo across the nation. And with that, the scene froze suspended in cinematic stillness, as if history itself was holding its breath. Cliffhanger. But it wasn't his words alone. It was her reaction that would echo across the nation. The courtroom had barely emptied before the outside world caught fire. News outlets scrambled to push breaking alerts, clipping Jasmine Crockett's searing counterattack into digestible, shareable bursts. Within minutes, hashtags began to trend. Hashtag Crockett Counterstrike, hashtag Justice Served, and simply hashtag Jasmine. It was no longer just a legal moment. It was a cultural ignition. Twitter feeds flooded. TikTok loops replayed her final words again and again, slowed down, remixed, captioned with lines like, "This is how you slay arrogance." Instagram flooded with fan art, bold portraits of Crockett in superheroic poses, captions calling her the people's advocate. On cable news, commentators leaned forward in their chairs. Some tried to downplay it, calling it just another heated exchange. Da-da! But the voices that resonated louder were the ones acknowledging history in motion. "This wasn't just a win in court," said one anchor. "This was a masterclass in clarity, courage, and control." Breyer's subtle nod. That single, almost imperceptible gesture of respect was replayed nearly as often as Crockett's words themselves. Commentators marveled at it, the seasoned justice leaning forward, breaking through his mask of neutrality, acknowledging with his eyes what the world already felt in their bones, everyday voices. Extraordinary echoes in barbershops and beauty salons, people swapped phones, replaying the moment, heads shaking in disbelief and admiration. College students tweeted that they wanted to study law just to be like her. Parents shared the clip with their children, whispering that this was what it looked like to stand tall against power. On Reddit, threads ballooned with thousands of comments. One post read, "This wasn't a lawyer winning an argument. This was David hitting Goliath dead in the forehead." Another quipped, "Villains got roasted so bad they'll need witness protection for their egos." The memes came fast and merciless. Screenshots of Crockett mid-sentence paired with captions like, "When you bring logic to a feelings fight," spread like wildfire. Her opponents, once smug, posturing, untouchable, were now caricatures. Their clipped reactions turned into gifs of blinking, sweating, and silence. The arrogance they wore like armor had been stripped away and mocked into dust. Newsrooms split. But audiences unite, not every outlet celebrated. Some pundits scoffed, framing Crockett's passion as grandstanding. They clipped her words selectively, trying to paint her as combative. But the tidal wave of public response drowned those narratives almost instantly. Online audiences replied with clips of the full exchange, calling out attempts to twist the truth. The collective voice was clear. People weren't going to let this moment be diluted or dismissed. What had happened was undeniable. Even rivals within the political arena, usually quick to score cheap points, treaded carefully. To attack Crockett now would be to alienate a public riding high on admiration and pride. Instead, many remained silent, calculating, wary of feeding the fire further. The personal becomes symbolic soon. Crockett's face was on magazine covers. Headlines spoke of her mic drop moment as if it were a cultural milestone, not just courtroom strategy. Editorials called her a rising force of truth, the calm in chaos, and the attorney who reminded America of what dignity looks like under fire. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about what she represented: intelligence over arrogance, composure over bluster, humanity over performance. High school debate teams analyzed her cadence. Activists quoted her lines on placards at rallies. Even comedians took the stage, with impressions of her opponents fumbling against her precision, drawing laughter and applause. A cultural earthquake, the ripple had become a shockwave. Crockett wasn't simply trending. She was becoming a symbol, stand-in, for anyone who had ever been underestimated, cornered, or dismissed, and who had, against the odds, found their moment to strike back with brilliance. The narrator's voice lingers over this transformation. What began as a courtroom battle became a cultural earthquake. It was no longer confined to marble halls or legal briefs. It lived in the voices of millions, etched into memes, hashtags, and headlines. Crockett had not only dismantled arrogance, she had given the world a masterclass in courage. And yet, amid the noise, the narrator's tone shifts, low and reverent. But beyond the hashtags, beyond the laughter and applause, one timeless lesson was etched in history. And that lesson, the truth at the heart of it all, was yet to be revealed. Cliffhanger close, the music swells. Screen fades to black, leaving only the echo of the words, but beyond the noise. One timeless lesson was etched in history. The dust had settled. The headlines had begun to fade, and the hashtags, though still echoing, were slowly replaced by the next digital storm. Yet what remained was not the frenzy, not the viral clips, not even the memes. What remained was something deeper, something timeless, because when the courtroom lights dim, when the microphones go silent, and when history looks back, it never remembers the noise. It remembers the truth, and the truth is this: Jasmine Crockett had done more than win an argument. She had reframed the debate entirely. This was never about a single exchange of words. It was about dignity versus arrogance, about whether power would continue to mock justice, or whether justice would finally remind power that it cannot laugh. Forever, Crockett, in her moment of brilliance, didn't just stand up for herself. She stood up for everyone who had ever been belittled, underestimated, or dismissed. Her counterattack became a mirror that forced society to see itself. The sneers of those who think cruelty is strength, the silence of those too afraid to speak, and the rare courage of those willing to risk everything to say enough. Justice Breyer's subtle gesture, his lean forward, his softened eyes. That fleeting nod of respect was more than courtroom etiquette. It was history's quiet confirmation, reminder that even in the highest chambers of judgment, humanity still recognizes humanity. Narrator, in that moment, the debate was no longer about legal technicalities or partisan maneuvering. It was about something greater. It was about who we are and who we choose to be. Because every society eventually faces the same question: will dignity define us, or will arrogance devour us? And here was the answer: not in textbooks, not in theories, but in one woman's refusal to bow to mockery. The lesson that echoed far beyond that courtroom was not that clever words can defeat cruel ones. It was that truth, anchored in dignity, outlives mockery. Always. Think about it. Empires crumble. Regimes fall. Arrogance, no matter how loud, always burns itself out. But dignity is immortal. It whispers across generations. It fuels revolutions. It builds bridges between strangers. And it teaches every child, watching from the sidelines, that respect is not a weakness, it is the foundation of true strength. Jasmine Crockett reminded the world that the measure of power is not how many people you can silence, but how many people you can uplift. The villains in this story, those who smirked, those who jeered, those who thought arrogance would carry the day, were left with nothing. Their moment of noise dissolved into a silence of shame. Because when history writes its chapters, it never glorifies mockery. It glorifies courage. Narrator. And so, what began as a clash of words became a timeless parable. Reminder etched into the conscience of a nation that justice is not abstract. Dignity is not optional, and truth, though often silenced, never stays buried for long. The moral was clear. It was not just about Jasmine Crockett. It was about us. About the kind of society we are building. About whether we, too, will rise when mocked, stay silent when others are belittled, because the fight for dignity is never confined to a courtroom. It happens in schools, in workplaces, in families, in every corner of human life. And every time someone refuses to let arrogance win, they keep the flame alive. And so, as the world moved on, as hashtags faded and news cycles turned, the story remained. Not as entertainment, but as a beacon. A reminder that justice is fragile, but never powerless. That truth is quiet, but never weak. And that dignity always outshines arrogance. Because in the end, it was never about the noise. It was about the light. And dignity always outshines arrogance. The story we began with, Justice Stephen Breyer respects Jasmine Crockett's brilliance. And her frozen reaction that silenced the courtroom has now come full circle. It wasn't just a moment of applause or recognition, it was validation. Validation that brilliance cannot be ignored, that courage in the face of arrogance leaves a mark deeper than any insult could carve. Crockett's pause, her shock, her breath stolen by respect, became a mirror for all of us. A reminder that even the highest halls of justice bend when truth speaks clearly, because in that instant, dignity triumphed. And Justice Breyer's nod wasn't just to her, it was to every voice that has ever been doubted, dismissed, or disrespected. It was a recognition that Brilliance deserves not only to be heard, but to be honored. And now, the question turns to you. If this moment stirred something inside you, if you felt those chills when silence fell and respect took the floor, don't just let it pass. Share it, speak it, carry it. Because every time we amplify moments like this, we remind the world that arrogance will never outshine dignity. So here's your call to action. Share this story. Subscribe for more truths that inspire. Remember, Brilliance deserves a voice. And as the lights dim on this chapter, let one line echo in your mind. In that courtroom, respect became louder than arrogance.